So now he's back in the Imperium and connected with his chapter once more. How does Lionel Johnson command the Dark Angels? How has he shaken up the hunt for the Fallen? And what fresh conflicts is he leading his new chapter into? Let's talk about the Lion's new lore in contemporary Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk a little bit more about the lore for Lionel Johnson, doing a quick recap of the circumstances that brought him back to the fore in the 41st millennium, and in particular delving into new details from the Dark Angels Codex that shine a greater light as to his reintegration with his chapter. Lionel Johnson was the second Loyalist Primarch to return to Warhammer 40k, his model appearing in late 9th edition at the climax of the Arks of Omen saga, and bringing with it some new 40k lore and big updates to his story and outlook in general. I thought we'd quickly go over those events, and then talk about an area where I was kind of interested to find out more. We kind of left the action in Arks of Omen with him newly reunited with his chapter for the first time, and it was really quite interested to see how the return of their Primarch would affect the Unforgiven, particularly as some of his goals might not have necessarily been in line with the chapter's aims and ways that they did things prior to his return. As I'm sure most people watching this well know, the old lore before the Lion's return was that Lionel Johnson returned to Caliban post the heresy, only to find the Dark Angels' reinforcements fallen to chaos under the command of his former mentor Luther, opening fire on their returning Primarch's fleet, and the Dark Angels proceeding to carpet bomb the planet basically out of existence in retribution, and the Lion makes planetfall to duel his treacherous lieutenant. Swollen with the powers of chaos, Luther and the Lion both overcome each other, though hesitate to strike the fatal blow, both being mortally wounded and dragged into the warp. The fallen are scattered throughout space and time, and the loyalist Dark Angels that survive convert the shattered remnants of their fortress monastery into the great space engine known as the Rock, finding Luther and keeping him a prisoner for millennia, attempting to extract repentance and absolution, but Luther will only answer to the Lion himself. Unbeknownst to the chapter at large, Lionel Johnson is carried from the warp storm by the Watchers in the Dark and interred within the bowels of the Rock. A previous codex had stated that his wounds were healed, and he would arise to return in the hours of the chapter's greatest need. Post-heresy, the fallen Dark Angels turned up from the warp in either smaller or greater numbers, and did so quite regularly. They had no reason to keep their treachery a secret, as the Dark Angels had previously tried to do, not wanting to publicise that half of their legion fell to chaos, as it would be looked at with dim eyes by the rest of the Imperium. Generally in old lore, the vast majority of them tended to be aligned with chaos, though in recent times it's more clear that not all of them truly fell in this way, and are more sort of independent soldiers, following orders by their treacherous commanders. The Dark Angels place a priority on hunting them down, extracting them back to the Rock for interrogation, torture and death. Though not every single confrontation goes their way, there's a notable incursion by the fallen demon prince Marbas, who leads an incursion into the Rock and frees Luther from his cell, his current whereabouts unknown. In contemporary 40k, the story of his return was largely handled by the Lion Son of the Forest by Mike Brooks, so spoiler alert for a few broad plot points here if you want to read this. The book has the Lion awaken in the warp forest of Old Caliban, which now seems to be a sort of supernatural place within the warp. It's not clear how he was conveyed there, and he has no memory of such. The last thing that he can remember is his fight with Luther, but it later becomes apparent that he appears to be in this supernatural forest due to a new power that he has, able to walk through the warp in this way, sort of like a great green questing knight of legend, and he can use this to get from planet to planet, sometimes with companions sworn to secrecy. His long sleep hasn't protected him fully from aging, and he is certainly older than he was before at the time of the heresy. There seems to be undiminished in the Mitre of Primarch, and even if perhaps his initial combat prowess seems a bit weaker in this book, he's able to go toe-to-toe with Angron at a later date. In this book he acquires his present-setting weapons, fealty pulled from a boulder, sword in the stone style, mid-fight, though it's maybe a bit ambiguous whether or not it was partly just in a armory on an isolated planet, and the Emperor's shield was truly within the whole warp forest thing, dueling a warp entity that takes the faces of each of his brother Primarchs in turn, with the Emperor seeming to bless him with his own shield, and he uses his new crown protection to defeat that demon. The shield is able to redirect energy back at the person that attacked it, and can be a weapon of its own right. Throughout the book, he's initially very isolated and starts to build a small army and coalition around him, which is made entirely of fallen, The line makes contact with many of them and finds that they're not actually corrupted by chaos and are willing to join him and reunite with the Primarch. The ones that he encounters were either ignorant of Luther's overall nefarious plans or bore some resentment to him due to him essentially abandoning them on their homeworld for half the heresy, or just unclear as to the confrontation that ensued, thinking that it was the line that was attacking them rather than the other way round. Within the rest of that book, he uses this force of Risen Fallen to carve himself out a small empire in a cluster of nearby planets, and defeats a pair of Chaos Fallen, including the Sorcerer Seraphax, establishing a little enclave within the Imperium Nihilus where he protects, broadly cut off from the rest of the Imperium by the warp storms with the opening of the Great Rift. He's not trying to build an empire in his own right, but merely offer protection to a bunch of worlds and defend humanity from the horrors until it can be established what's happened to his brothers and the Emperor. Then after this, the next lore update we get is from the Arks of Omen storyline. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels makes contact with his Lion Protectorate, investigating rumours of a Primarch's return and whether or not he needs to cast down some sort of false idol. The meeting between the two is broadly quite smooth, aside from perhaps the fairly understandable question of why are you wearing my dead brother's death mask? As to L. Johnson, the Primarchs were very recent things as opposed to being ancient figures of legend. The Primarch guides Dante and his forces to a site of a great confrontation between Vashtor and Abaddon versus the combined might of the Dark Angels successor chapters, Vashtor having chosen to lure them there to re-establish an ancient webway tunneling device to allow him to gain access to some forbidden superweapons, and for a vessel to make that device a reality, his Arks of Omen have reconstituted the planet of Caliban, twisted and reforged in the Demon Forge world of Wormwood, much to the annoyance of the Dark Angels for their legacy being so hideously corrupted. When the forces of the Dark Angels and Blood Angels make planetfall, it's found that to counter their assault, Abaddon has orchestrated it so some World Eaters are all ready to unleash the demon Primarch Angron upon the interlopers, Angron cutting a bloody swathe through the Imperial forces, including killing much of the Sanguinary Guard and threatening Dante, who is only saved at the line jumping in to intervene. The two duel in a titanic conflict throughout Vashtor's great palace of cogs and mechanisms, Angron's impatience and rage of course causing him to overreach himself. He's lured into some machinery, run through with fealty, and then his corporeal form detonated by backlash from the Emperor's shield. In spite of this victory though, the Lion calls the retreat. The demonic forces are too great for the Dark Angels upon the planet. The Primarch is spent from his fight from Angron. Essentially Vashtor is victorious, setting off with his demon world of Wormwood to burrow through the webway, try and find his mysterious weapon, and apparently shows up next in the Pariah Nexus for some reason. That leaves Lionel Johnson reunited with his Gene brothers, of course, and in the aftermath of the Arks of Omen story there wasn't really much detail on how things would proceed from there. It certainly seems like there's some obvious tensions between the Lion and his own chapter, maybe most notably the idea of Risen Fallen going against the very ethos of the Dark Angels, who generally just hunt them down, interrogate and exterminate them. Now he's back with the Imperium at large, he also has to deal with the weird 40k Imperial bureaucracy and cult-like weirdness. I feel like there's a lot of interest as to what happens when he first makes contact with Gilliman. Again, some obvious chance for tensions there. I feel like that would be really nice to have it explored in an actual novel sometime. In the meantime though, Codex Dark Angels did definitely have some interesting details, and while the lore section of the Codex isn't the most huge thing in the world, it definitely had a few fun details as to how the Lion is adapting his chapter once more. First up, I thought it was interesting that they confirmed that he was indeed on the rock all this time. There wasn't any sort of great retcon as to where he'd been within the heresy. He was just generally sleeping on the rock in a secret chamber, known only by the Watchers in the Dark, and apparently Luther as well. The Codex describes him as being mortally wounded by Luther in that duel where they basically both injured each other grievously. And supposedly at the time of that fight, Luther bore witness to the Watchers spiriting him away to the bowels of the rock. But it maybe feels a bit weird that he would absolutely know that he's still there somehow if he is spending the rest of the time interrogated by the Supreme Grand Masters in turn in his own disturbing dark cell. In spite of all the torture and interrogation techniques over the centuries, he never gave up the secrets that Lionel Johnson was alive and well, and likely much closer than the vast majority of their chapter could ever possibly think. Prior to his escape, Luther's described as irretrievably mad, his brain utterly twisted by the full horror of what he did with his own betrayal prior to his rescue by the demon prince Fallen Marbas. I feel like it would be really cool if they ever did get around to giving the Fallen Dark Angels their own mini-army range. It'd be really cool to see Luther, and maybe that demon prince in particular. I would have said it was incredibly unlikely before, but seeing as they just went all in on an enormous Kroot range, it does seem that just about anything could be possible from Games Workshop, at least once they're burnt through other ideas. Otherwise, now he's taken up residence in the Rock, Lionel Johnson maintains a sort of austere throne room in the upper levels, flanked by honour guards and laden with banners, and it's there that he entertains any petitions from Imperial commanders and makes more open war plans against the enemies of mankind. Deep within the bowels of the Rock, he also has his secret inner sanctum, which feels very Dark Angels. The existence and whereabouts of that is known only to the highest ranking Inner Circle members, and they only at his express invitation. It's there that he takes counsel with his chapter in Truth, specifically mentioned are figures like Azrael, Belial, and Ezekiel, discussing the overall strategy for his chapter and the Unforgiven in general, and this Dark Sanctum is often noted to be prowled by concentrations of the Watchers in the Dark, and his own ethereal arboreal traces of his forest walking. It's maybe no real surprise that he acts as the ultimate authority on the Rock. He alone is knowing of all secrets and intricacies of the complex organization of the chapter and their successors, and certainly does outrank Supreme Grandmaster Azrael, though he's still perhaps at the forefront of leading the chapter in many war zones, conflicts, and matters that don't necessarily need the attention of the Primarch. L. Johnson is often known to roam far from the Rock, and might do so at little warning. He might either travel via his own mysterious forest walking powers, alone or with companions, or strike out with the Dark Angels' fleets, usually with specific goals in mind to topple a certain chaos dictator, hunt a great monster, or seek out secrets and quests that are known only to him. For that reason, he's gained a reputation for stepping from the shadows on numerous occasions to lead his successor chapters into battle when it's clear that they need his help and guidance. In general, his way of operation tends to be serving the light from the shadows, as opposed to his brother Gilliman orchestrating enormous crusades and the great logistical defense of entire sectors, taking a more subtle approach to his presence within the Imperium Nihilus. Perhaps one of the areas where he's most at odds with the rest of the Inner Circle is the issue of the secrets of the Fallen. The line is self-assured enough to not show outward concern for the secrets that Luther or the other Fallen might reveal. Not to the point where he's deeming an end to the great hunt for the Fallen, but doesn't share the same laser-driven fixation on concealing the supposed sins of the Legion's past. This was perhaps one of the areas I was more interested in as an area of contention with the rest of the Dark Angels. It seems that Lionel Johnson makes no effort to turn the chapter from its previous ways of hunting down the Fallen, though perhaps hasn't tended to be the active instigator to go and seek them out anywhere near as much as the rest of the Inner Circle. The greatest change to their way of operating is that previously the capturing of any Fallen would inevitably lead to their death, either essentially tortured to death by an interrogator chaplain if they remained unrepentant, or if their erstwhile battle brother had confessed and repented their sins, they'd be offered a clean death with the Emperor's mercy. As mentioned in past lore, there wasn't really much to suggest that the vast majority of the Fallen weren't servants of chaos, but given the new lore in the Indomitors era, things seem to be far more murky. Lots of Fallen out there who just walk their own way, or act as pirates and raiders, or continue to secretly serve the Imperium in some manner. On a fairly regular basis, the Lion might often intervene in the interrogation of a given Fallen if he deems fit, his sinister cowled form appearing to watch over the mercies of the interrogator chaplain doing the work, commanding them to retire for a period while he can truly talk with his gene son, and then one of two outcomes will occur. Either Lionel Johnson emerges later and the chaplain is ordered to resume their work, the words of the Primarch perhaps unable to redeem this lost soul, or they will find the Lion and their previous captive are now gone from the room. Presumably either genuine repentance has been claimed, and the Lion will allow his previous fallen battle brother to rise to service once more, or perhaps much more sinister, the clearly unredeemed twisted monster of chaos that go missing in this fashion are perhaps selected by some sort of darker punishment or execution ordained by the Primarch himself. Very few among the Inner Circle are privy to what happens to these captives. That brings us to the Inner Circle Companions, though, the somewhat euphemistic name for the Lion's redeemed fallen, and the way that they can continue to serve within the chapter while still standing apart. These redeemed knights wield caliber-knight greatswords and act as bodyguards to the chapter's heroes, or independently go about fulfilling their own quests while fighting alongside unforgiven forces, always arriving unannounced and swear a vow of silence to outsiders, only communicating with each other with lines of encrypted vox chatter. Even the chapter's grandmasters are not privy to the exact origin of them, only knowing that the line permits them and allows them to fight alongside. Though I must admit it really doesn't seem like it's the hardest thing to work out in the world, particularly if you're supposedly fighting alongside them and they're being a bodyguard for you. And it maybe does feel like a bit of a weak point in the lore that the notably secretive Dark Angels would permit such a force within their ranks, unless absolutely explicitly told to do so by their Primarch on each occasion. Maybe just feels like one of those details that's kind of nice in theory, but perhaps just doesn't really make that much sense if you think about it a bit more. I think it is quite cool, though, to have these ancient Space Marines redeemed from the treachery of their commanders and fighting against the enemies of the Emperor once more. Returning to focus back on the Lion himself as well, he does seem to have undergone at least a few character changes since the heresy. Obviously, he's not getting any sort of full rewrite or anything like that. He remains a dour and pragmatic warrior knight with a great tactical insight and combat prowess, keeping his own secretive counsel and not being afraid to walk his own path when it makes more sense. I felt like the Mike Brooks book had him being a bit less hot-headed and a bit more humanitarian, perhaps a little bit more focus on protecting the Imperial populaces as opposed to just thinking about the grand picture in the wake of the carnage of the Horus heresy. From the Codex, he's described as a bit more fey and unsettling, shadows deepening around him whenever he's angry or brooding, maybe implying that alongside his forest walking, he's just taken on a little bit more of a supernatural nature than he used to. I did think that that was quite a big update, going from being a relatively practical and grounded sort of character in the heresy to someone who's a bit more of a mythical knight and legend and has their own mysterious warp-like powers. In the Codex as well, he's also noticed to sometimes stand within Luther's cell meditating, reflecting on the centuries of imprisonment and torture that must have happened here to his former mentor. Those goals currently aren't clear regarding their meeting and reunion, whether he'll be seeking retribution and execution, or trying to redeem the ultimate traitor to the Dark Angels. It is quite fun to see little reactions to any other Imperial things that have been happening since his Great Sleep. On learning that his legion has been split into multiple small chapters to stop any one person from commanding the might of a Space Marine legion, he expressed annoyance to Gilliman there for his presumption to be able to do that. As mentioned, I thought it would be really interesting to see how they interact whenever they get some lore for that in the future. It'll be interesting to see how they reconcile Gilliman basically having assumed total command of the Imperium, where the Lion is basically now his equal, and I can't imagine him taking direct orders and authority without him also agreeing on the same course of action. When reacting to the Imperium himself within the Codex, it sounds like he's largely very contemptuous of what his father's empire has become, having intense disdain for impractical bureaucracy and superstition wherever it manifests, and that is absolutely everywhere in the Imperium, whether it's the Imperial Creed and Ecclesiarchy to the Mechanicum, or the corruption of various planetary governors. With his authority as a Primarch, there's little who'll gainsay him, though, and he's not afraid to promote or demote established bureaucrats or leaders, far favouring those who take practical action and demonstrate loyalty through their deeds, as opposed to sly politicians or self-aggrandizing cultists. Needless to say, he's absolutely committed to driving back the forces of chaos. He described Abaddon as my brother's wayward son, and that he'd deal with them as soon as their paths should cross. And I did think it was kind of funny within the Mike Brooks book that he reacted to Helldrakes with just saying, "Is there really nothing that hasn't got worse in this new galaxy?" I guess demon engines en masse weren't really such a thing in the days of the heresy compared with more just sort of standard traitor legions fighting with the same technology. Finally, in the Codex, we get a glimpse of the Lion in action, taken to the fight when Master Lazarus and a company of Primaris Marines, including some infiltrators, are beset by a great Tyranid swarm, appearing when their defensive positions are assailed by no less than 3 Screamer Killer Carnifexes, commanded by a Hive Tyrant. The Lion joins the fray from the shadows, wielding fealty and the Emperor's shield, and flanked by a band of the Inner Circle companions acting as his honour guard. Perhaps as you'd imagine, with the sheer power Accompanied by the plot armor of the Primarch, there's not much hope for the Tyranid monsters when they're facing such a mighty foe. The line dispatches one Carnifex by catching its swipe on the Emperor's shield and then impaling it through the eye with fealty. Several companions are slain by another, the remaining ones using the distraction to carve it up with their greatswords, and the third is held off by Lionel Johnson parrying its many blows with his sword before it's laid low by heavy weapon fire, its carapace breached and melted asunder. Then the line duels the Hive Tyrant, matches it blow for blow, catching its bone saber on fealty before cutting off its sword arm. The Hive Tyrant does manage to get in a blow on the lion, wrapping its lash whip around his neck and drawing blood, though the temporary reprieve is short-lived as the lion smashes its chest with the power field from the Emperor's shield before beheading the beast. Seems like Lionel Johnson, in the context of current 40k, still has his monster slaying abilities absolutely intact, and he ends the sequence by marshalling his Dark Angels and charging headlong into the remaining disorganized swarm. Overall though, that's a fair few fun details for the Primarch in the Codex. I think it is nice they actually drilled into a few of the big questions that people might have as to how he's going to be shaping his gene sons in his own image. It looks like the hunt for the Fallen certainly isn't going to be abating anytime soon for the Dark Angels. To be honest though, I wasn't really expecting them to make any huge changes with that. Even if the Primarch is back, it would have been kind of strange to just completely write that out of the chapter's history, given that so much of their lore and general backstory is dependent upon it. It's kind of fun to see where they'll go with him next. Interesting to think that he's just going to be his own shadowy presence, questing and fighting back against the Chaos and the Imperium Nihilus, that has the potential to turn up to just about any conflicts in the region unbidden. I feel like the most fun updates that they'll go for from here would be how he winds up interacting with Gilliman when that happens, and also what happens when the actual Fallen plotline progresses somewhat. I'm not sure if that will be necessarily anything anytime soon though. They just sort of feel like one of those ideas out there that at some point Games Workshop might get around to making some models for. Until that point I'm maybe a bit dubious as to how fast they'd get on to making any sort of central update to that same story. Let me know your thoughts though, looking forward to your takes as to how Lionel Johnson is settling in with his Dark Angels chapter once more. If you've enjoyed the video then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep up the regular 40k content. I generally tend to focus a bit more on gameplay, though it is fun to look into the major developments of 40k lore once in a while. Finally, if you have been finding videos like this interesting or entertaining, I would just like to mention that the channel does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.